Hi everyone. For today's video, we are going to be doing one thing and one thing only. We are going to be reading an essay I wrote titled White Moderates Don't Challenge Fascism, Critiquing Solomon Nelson. The essay is about my critique of Solomon Nelson, who responded to a response of mine between him and Daniel Pekich. So, the essay is about that, and that's what we'll be reading. And specifically, this essay was made in response to my reply to Persephone van der Waard by Solomon Nelson, which he released 2 months ago on March 29th, 2025. Also, we'll be referencing Umberto Eco's 14 points. So I thought before we start, I could at least show you that, as it's really important, and I don't actually list all of Eco's points in my essay itself. So if we scroll down, here are the 14 points. Some of the more famous ones being the cult of tradition and the rejection of modernism, but there are various other ones as well, such as pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. But there's 14 of them. You can pause the screen and look at it yourself if you want. I won't necessarily be referencing any of them, but I do think that anyone who is anti-fascist should familiarize themselves with these points. So here they are. And here again is Solomon Nelson's reply to me, specifically their video, my reply to Persephone van der Waard. And now responding to that is my essay, White Moderates Don't Challenge Fascism. So without further ado, here we go. We're going to read it from top to bottom. This essay, White Moderates Don't Challenge Fascism, responds to a critique I received from a political opponent, in which my reply recruits from my own social network of friends, lovers, and associates. It remains part of my sex positivity series, albeit coming from outside the books themselves, i.e., belonging to a disparate body of essays and interviews that fall under the same basic umbrella, but often will engage with more than the usual suspects, someone who vocally disagrees with us in times of state, even planetary crisis, and with whom various members of the Sex Positivity Project make themselves heard. This is the Safe for Work version, meaning most of the images have been censored, cropped, or omitted. Refer to the Not Safe for Work version on my website to see everything uncensored. Also, some context before we start. I wrote this nonprofit essay in response to Solomon Nelson disagreeing with my friends, whose evidence to fatphobia Solomon summarily rejected. A bigotry for one is a bigotry for all, including bigotry extending to others, tied to systemic oppression. As such, I choose to respond to Solomon's dismissal by writing an essay supported with various visual aids. While the models of these aids partook of their own free will, several examples come from older works of mine about universal liberation, re from my larger book series featured on this website, e.g., Bay, Crow, Sinead, and Nix. That being said, the vast majority were commissioned by me to appear directly in this essay. Disclaimer regarding essay contents. This essay is nonprofit and provided for purposes of education, critique, and satire, i.e. as a matter of professional opinion against multiple other public figures and publicly available material during times of state crisis, Solomon Nelson and Daniel Pekich's YouTube channels, but also the medical industry and police state, etc. It's part of the larger work I do beyond my book series, e.g., my Hailing Hellions Q&A, where I interview sex workers of all different kinds. Content warning: fatphobia, ableism, racism, rape, transphobia, medical abuse, whorephobia, fascism, police brutality, and genocide. White moderates don't challenge fascism. My critique of Solomon Nelson's moderate fatphobia, medicalized language, and other bigotries. This essay was written in response to Solomon Nelson's recent YouTube video, My Reply to Persephone Waard. I didn't respond back in March when it initially released for various reasons, namely how YouTube failed to notify me, but also because I had a book series to finish, Sex Positivity versus Sex Coercion, or Gothic Communism, Liberating Sex Work Under Capitalism Through Iconoclastic Art. Now that I've written a response with visual aids, supplying them, as a trans woman educator who works with other sex workers, i.e. on a larger project I'm the director of, re. my book series. In conversational terms, I'm the whore, and Solomon's the white moderate pimp. Both of us use our lily white bodies to get our points across. Chiseled straight otter versus shapely gay twink, canon versus camp, the prudes versus the crudes. Note, when calling Solomon, David, or anyone else a pimp here, I'm specifically treating the word as a qualifier tied to my opinion, i.e. as a matter of research, insofar as their behavior supports fascism according to said opinion tied to my larger body of work. Hence, I'm using pimp in the academic sense, not a statement of fact which others can prove false. So-and-so are like pimps, in some poetic manner I use specifically to critique their problematic behavior and or belief system, not literal pimps who traffic in women or other victims. The same unless specified goes for words like genocide, complicit, himbo, racist, bigot, Nazi, or anything else. We'll get to Nazi in a bit. Pure opinion cannot be defamation under American law because opinions are protected by free speech. Calling someone a pimp is not the same thing as accusing them of rape, i.e. the word rape will come up repeatedly in this essay, and yet the word as I define it is more complicated, as having a poetic usage in Gothic and academia versus a legal criminal usage. That being said, I do not describe Solomon or Daniel through its poetic usage, nor accuse them of its legal criminal usage. Furthermore, if I did attach the word to a specific person, I would be very clear about which version I was using when doing so, e.g. as with my ex Jadis, aka Lindsay Wheeler, who sexually abused me, and who I state as much in my various writings about them, re. unmasking my abuser. There's also Sean Roden, a bodybuilder I mentioned briefly as someone legally accused of rape, therefore someone I can describe accurately as alleged rapist in the legal sense. I use the word whore to describe a broad swath of sex workers, or workers who are sexualized, i.e. not just prostitutes in the legal criminal sense, but workers treated like prostitutes or pimps, insofar as their work is sexualized, be it paid, unpaid, e.g. women's work, referring to a wide variety of activities, too numerous to list here, and work commonly called sex work ranging from the Hooters girl, an airline stewardess, your wife, girlfriend, or a cam girl, etc. In other words, my usage for whore is academically broad, the same way my usage of pimp is academic and broad. As such, this essay isn't a debate per se, but a seminar response discussing human rights as not up for debate, one I hope feels constructive in ways that remind my audience who's cooler than capital. Doctors are all right sometimes, but everyone loves the whore, the Gothic, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I.e., as explained by this bitch in ways both nerdy and slutty, they're not mutually exclusive, babes. Ari, when the man comes around, show him your aegis. To it, Solomon will have to respond not just to my nerdy side, but slutty side, and that of my fat, gay, and or not-white friends, e.g. Crow above, as dialectical material, liminal, holistic, dualistic, etc. Silence is genocide, death, and rape, which capital does by design. We whores speak through sex in ways that are harder to deny, apologia, rape, or otherwise, i.e. generally through double standards that appear most visibly when presented side by side, re. Solomon versus myself, e.g. straight, male nipples, versus trans emasculation, automatically sexualizing trans woman bodies, below. Here's the basic definition for trans emasculation. In case you're curious, you can read it. Also, before we proceed, I wanted to read my definition of rape from the footnote. My and my friend's work plays with rape during calculated risk, effectively putting rape in quotes during a process I coined called Gothic BDSM, RE from the Demon Module's Rape Reprise. Quote, as I move through this series, though, the definition for Gothic BDSM has narrowed, according to my focus on the term specifically to play with rape as I define it. If we scroll down, my definition of rape reads as follows. Rape meaning for our purposes to disempower someone or somewhere, a person, culture, or place in order to harm them, generally through fetishizing and alienizing acts or circumstances, socio-material conditions that target the mind, body, and or spirit. Rape can be of the mind, spirit, body, and or culture, the land or things tied to it during genocide, etc. It can be individual and or on a mass scale, either type committed by a great destroyer. And that's basically the gist. Alright, let's continue. Table of contents. Abstracts, cops, whores, and capitalist realism summarizes the entire essay's nuts and bolts. The Gothic and its heretical food for thought discusses the Gothic according to its usage here, also why I don't use it as much as I otherwise could with Solomon. Explaining my basic approach, explains how my essay critiques Solomon's basic argument, i.e. as something to interpret, as well as various interpretations about my arguments he makes that I want to correct, e.g. his narrowing of the word Nazi, to make it all but useless at spotting and critiquing fascism as a widespread phenomenon. Critiquing Solomon's response, the body of the essay, which critiques Solomon's cop-like approach, RE is a white straight moderate whose fatphobia, medicalized language, and other bigotries uphold capitalist realism. Abashed the devil stood, in addition to this essay's not safe for work portion, which features models who agreed to appear in the essay itself, i.e. to counter and combat Solomon's fatphobia, transphobia, racism, and other bigotries with their body's art and subsequent labor value. Conclusion and postscript wraps things up, explaining why I won't debate Solomon in the future, and why his defense of Daniel Pekich is highly sus. Abstract, cops, whores, and capitalist realism. We've already established the purpose of this essay. Its thesis argument concerns capitalist realism, or Mark Fisher's observation that it's easier for most people to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, with whores being viewed as such. My thesis here is, cops pimp whores to maintain capitalist realism. Doctors are cops, and Solomon Nelson, vis-a-vis our exchange, is playing doctor. In turn, ACAB, but also ASAB, i.e. cops serve the state, and neither is your friend. Despite how they disguise themselves, capital rapes by design, and cops, reactionary or moderate, serve capital through capitalist realism. Now let's outline the basic parts, i.e. how I use them versus Solomon and capital. As a trans sex worker gothicist, I specialize in aesthetics, particularly that of sex workers and their alien, hauntological, retrofuture fetishization by state powers, especially tokenism, which we won't explore here. This abjection process, us versus them, Ari Kristeva, operates to a structure that relies upon routine invasion, i.e. of us, by the state having made us alien, including our routine dismemberment, via superiority aesthetics, therefore purity arguments that are patriarchal from the outset, but also heteronormative, Cartesian, and settler colonial under imperialism being the highest, oldest form of capitalism. Capitalism sexualizes everything, and all workers are pimped by capital to some degree, i.e. those with more privilege historically materially prone to betray worker rights for states' rights, men pimp men, women pimp other women, and minorities, whores of privilege pimp whores with less privilege, and so on. Yet state arguments, particularly those of logic, are trumped by function as logical and illogical, Gothic, meaning how we revolutionary whores use such things in reverse, i.e. during oppositional praxis, our class culture and race consciousness from Marx to us versus state-induced dormancy through anesthesia, lobotomy, and euthanasia, all medical terms enforcing a built-in genocidal status quo enjoyed and enforced by straight male white moderates like Solomon Nelson. Nature versus the state, where women, or those treating like women, including minorities of different kinds, are abused in their literal and figurative sleep, only to have their testimony ignored. Antonia will perceive her dishonor, but be unaware of her ravisher. All of this is criminogenic, meaning dogma for the process of abjection, Yet fetishizing power cuts both ways, e.g. there's no Rubens monopoly, and nothing men of reason fear more than a pissed-off naked woman they can't control. Her voyeurism irks them to no end, precisely because it testifies against state actors. Horrors argue historically from positions of systemic disadvantage, preyed upon by state forces for our biology since ancient times, but also our labor value in other forms, namely culture, e.g. religion and gender, and race. Gaslight, gatekeep, girlboss. We take our powers back, stolen from us on the aegis, i.e. as something cops of any sort cannot monopolize, but where we break said monopoly on visibly combative ways, e.g. Kuo and I above, but also my other friends, e.g. next page, who are thinkers and activists to similar degrees through a shared pedagogy of the whore, our cryptonomy process showing and hiding whatever we require. Gaslight this. To varying degrees of oppression, nature is something for men of reason to pimp, shame, humiliate, dehumanize, and destroy behind various cloaked advertisements, i.e. the cryptonomy of American liberalism and Western values, antagonize nature as monstrous feminine, and put it cheaply to work. Capital sexualizes all labor and nature differently. Function is anisotropic, we whores reversing objection through oppositional cryptonomy to shrink profit, ergo the state and its traitors. Cops, then, are traitors to labor who defend privatization for the state. A whore is anything cops can pimp, through moderate to reactionary degrees, not just out-and-out sex workers. A pimp is a cop, and doctors, or those acting as doctors, can pimp merely by turning a blind eye. Solomon Nelson looking the other way, defending the state through capitalist realism, as cops do, versus vocally challenging billionaires when confronted by an educated whore like me, saying the quiet part out loud. State fictions versus worker fictions, telling truth through lies, aka darkness visible. Except now, I've brought friends, e.g. past collaborations, but also fresh ones too, i.e. a poetic show of solidarity and expression defying state notions of logical superiority and its assorted baggage conducive to police violence, including medical violence, e.g. the denial of health care. Development is a war of mirrors, breaking capitalist realism on the aegis. Ass back, land back. Behold our smoldering backsides, our peachy rumps, our eyes of chaos and confusion. To Camp Marx, quote, the tradition of all dead horrors waves like a nightmare on the brains of the living, unquote. So does history repeat once in tragedy and then in farce beyond what Marx envisioned for our needs. We make things gay because we must. Marx was the start, not the end. Under capital, the state is always straight, white, able, and right, etc., and we fatties, fags, non-whites, whores, and disabled folk, etc., are always fucked. Framed as hysterical, sick, obese, and or afflicted with rapid onset dysphoria, etc. At the same time, capitalism is a hyper-object versus communism, another hyper-object across Pax Americana as a structure, not an event, i.e., as a settler colony and police state enforced across different registers by different actors, ignoring due process violations, meaning those currently happening in America, but also the history of ongoing genocides, wherever it suits them during capitalist realism. We'll get to that with Solomon, dressed up in medicalized cryptonomy furthering objection, e.g. euthanasia, eradication, extermination, purification, development, civilization, progress, etc. This obfuscation goes for land and labor alike, but also monstrous language, i.e. horrors are monsters, so if doctors want to examine my friends and I, we'll be naked for the procedure, and on territory where we hold the cards. Despite Solomon's quickness to blanket dismiss my work, it still has value, e.g. my research on Metroidvania, Ludogothic BDSM, Amazons, and Tolkien, i.e., as Phyllis rides Aristotle like an ass, a lesson, game, and critique all in one, but also a special chance for double standards to come out despite moderates trying to deny they exist. Nothing is more controlled than sex, and nerds can be cops that prudishly control sex through mirror and virgin whore syndrome. Whether Solomon does or doesn't remains to be seen, but our nudity inverts the nuclear order treating exposure as weakness, a psychosexual means of invalidation to strip, slaughter, and fleece prey with. Instead, it becomes our armor to protect, extradite us from harm, and language whores teach with its ancient yet newfound mysteries, speaking to penetrative violence, but also medical, carceral, and or otherwise. Empire is built on the backs of dead whores, who talk back through reenactments of past crimes, but also lessons. Sex is our weapon, our power of memory we take back from the state, i.e., from the imprecise fuzzy areas of the human condition and its monstrous feminine language that horrors occupy. We're unicorns to capture and study by those who formally reject us, the memory that reason forgets. So do horrors reclaim their power in ways cops can't disguise, discount, or otherwise defeat through routine betrayal, except the state won't protect cops when things get bad. It will cannibalize them outright or force them to punch down, i.e., during the usual Radcliffean nightmares of class, wedded to culture and race, to dutifully expose and banish the horror, so the state saves them, the cops, for last. Sure, one whore is a mad woman to dismiss easily enough. A group of whores profane, thus threaten the Protestant ethic and its secular veneer. One whose smug dismissal by in-group members like Solomon demonstrates what they and theirs care about, our obedience towards the nuclear model from Rome onwards, submitting to its various ideas of destiny on and into the present moment, e.g. biology or geography tied to race, re canonical essentialism. Per Gothic, the home is alien and doomed while scapegoating others, stealing their babies, labor, and land. We're the doomsayers, unknitting state designs. Whores are classically homewreckers. Truth is an instrument told through Gothic theater and beautiful lies, the splendid Mendax per Gothic fakes, re Hogel's ghost of the counterfeit, but also bodies and actors argued as false, i.e. by white straight men like Solomon Nelson acting in bad faith. The world's on fire, and the imperial boomerang swung the other way, while media shoved your head up your ass. Kindly pull it out before it's too late. The Gothic and its heretical food for thought. A quick sidebar before we start, to introduce readers to ideas relevant to my work on Gothic communism as holistic, but which we won't have time to unpack here. Read my books. Cannon vs. Camp effectively describes the process for how sex workers and other marginalized people survive cops, re those who defend privatization. To it, my essay prioritizes Solomon's response to my video about him, where I'll essentially be critiquing him based on my definition of cop. Always define your terms. We won't have time to familiarize him to Gothic beyond the basics of my overall work, i.e. capitalism alienates and sexualizes everything, re my PhD, doing so to cannibalize labor and nature as monstrous feminine for a system of preferential mistreatment. It does this through cops, which betray through matters of class, culture, and race. White moderates are class traitors, official or stochastic. So while fascists are reactionary and radicalized to bring imperialism home to empire, moderates enjoy the reasoned liberal side of the same imperial coin. Liberalism and fascism go hand in hand, historically defending capital, profit, and corporations, the state, from workers through all the usual tools, the monopolies, trifectas, and qualities of capital, i.e. as haunted by themselves per centrist dogma, aka the Star Wars problem, or similar stories. Doctors, by extension, are stochastic traitors of a medicalized sort, i.e. cops dealing through systems of medicalized shame and stigma, pimping the usual suspect as doctors do, e.g. fat and or trans people. Per the Protestant ethic, whoring nature out as forbidden fruit, something to kettle, redline, divide, and rape, conquer, all to keep state power right where it is. To it, there are 4 core theories that Gothic praxis relies on: abjection, cryptonomy, ontology, and chronotopes. Abjection performs us versus them, cryptonomy shows conceals, ontology embodies retro-future, and chronotopes are time spaces, e.g. haunted houses, Gothic castles, or castles in the flesh, i.e. spaces and dialogues known for ancient exploitation, of which whore pimp is the oldest profession, exploitation, and revenge for workers versus the state, the Medusa. This essay contains neo-Gothic elements for flavor, but also critical value / food for thought, re forbidden fruit, that I specialize in, i.e. for their prominent themes of sin and madness, which the Enlightenment classically rejects through a Puritan ethic, one that Solomon thoroughly embodies, and our own radicalism rejects during rape play, endemic to Gothic, see footnote. From Walpole's Otranto onwards, the neo-Gothic tradition pointedly critiques the nuclear model in hauntological language, i.e. haunted by rape as a dead giveaway, so to speak, re how capital and cops rape nature as monstrous feminine, through the usual revenge arguments, puns, and replacement fears. Abused on loop, nature returns from its past grave through future workers that cops pimp, thus rape, violating consent, specters of Marx to diagnose and chatelize, including doctors. Classically, women were property that doctors called hysterical, for example. This abuse remains, overwhelming the present era. As we'll see, similar biases extend to people of color and fat people, queer folk, etc., i.e. when imperialism comes home to roost during the imperial boomerang's grim harvest. Fascists hold the sickle, but moderates run interference, i.e. lawyers legalize genocide, and doctors medicalize it, but all cops abuse power for profit. ACAP because they steal our labor by framing it as alien whore, which again capital rapes by design. We steal it back on the aegis, reminding doctors, who tend to be sanctimonious, how they get mirror and virgin whore syndrome too, by using what we got, which we'll talk about during the conclusion. Theory is often complex. Nudity, a potent, subversive means of stripping things down to their bare necessities and power. Whores provoke. To that, whores test capitalist realism, as backed by cops' own inheritance anxieties, fearing the bourgeoisie and what they demand of workers, routine sacrifice, which reactionaries and moderates foist onto various minorities during the Protestant ethic damning some workers, i.e. while declaring to the world, we white straight male workers will not be replaced. Per parente, fascism is a false rebellion, which moderacy maintains through centrism as a trolley problem, one haunted by vasovagal theatrics, fight, flight, fawn, confusion, and oscillation, incels, medical isolation, divine judgment, imposturious authorities, endless surveillance, uncertain projection, doubles, fatal attraction, and retro-future nostalgia, war and rape culture, etc. Our power is something they fetishize and steal in tandem. Despite a staunch adherence to the aesthetic of logic, moderates worship the elite like fearsome gods, but also their dogmatic worldview. Furthermore, the Gothic concerns courtship under ambiguous circumstances. We're the Avenger, branded as heretic, reprobate whore since before we were born. But it's precisely our fellow workers we have to watch out for across all registers. Sometimes women and other token parties, but always cops. Doctors are cops. Anyone who challenges them, thus capitalist realism, a heretic to belittle, witch to burn, animal to tame, and or whore to harvest by the great destroyer, walking numinous, a bastard boogeyman, black knight unheimlich, getting medieval on our asses, hyphenating sex and force, love and hate, etc. The call classically comes from inside the house. All of these poetic devices boil down, as the Gothic historically does, through dialectical material context. To it, activism challenges police violence through the latter's objection process, i.e. us versus them equals objection, which class, culture, and race war can further or reverse to aid, disrupt, profit. i.e. capitalism alienates and sexualizes everything to defend or abjure, according to all the usual phobias in their arguments. States' rights versus worker rights, the whore's revenge versus the pimps seeking land back, labor back, sex back, monsters back. This includes doctors versus fatness as a health epidemic to shame, in all the usual ways, in which will apply to Solomon Nelson as something of a cop in that regard. Explaining my basic approach. I'm a very busy woman, thus lack the spare time to quote Solomon's coppery to death. Instead, I'll be relying on camp, but also summary and paraphrase. Also, despite my expertise in Gothic vernacular and poetic arguments, e.g. cryptonymy and the objection process furthering or challenging genocide, again, see paratextual documents for all of these terms, I've chosen to mostly omit them here, for more commonplace language that Solomon probably knows. By doing so, nonetheless remains an interpretation, i.e. of Solomon's arguments, albeit as an academic would, and while trying not to confuse him, even though I very easily could, doubtlessly will, because my arguments will sound alien to Solomon, not wholly unknown, but nonetheless foreign, hence worthy of dismissal and disdain through his usual approach defending capitalism. That doesn't mean I can't have fun while in Rome, i.e. I'm an academic campy whore, which informs my basic satirical approach versus unironically aping the Romans. Solomon represents the West in action, hence gives an avenue to critique the latter through the former. To that, it's not so much what he literally said verbatim that I critique, and more how I interpret it while taking my time and having fun, i.e. from my anti-fascist expertise, which targets neoliberalism in white moderates, but also different abuses committed by medical professionals, actual or de facto, playing the pimp, us cop, i.e. white moderates are fascists, with more/different masks, including doctors achieving fatphobic, transphobic, and whorephobic aims, etc. To summarize Solomon's response to my original critique, re. white moderates debating Nazis, he assigns blame to me like a doctor would, i.e. calmly and coldly calling it my fault how the left is divided, while hypocritically branding me an intellectual snob who pushes for a utopian worldview that Marx would roll in his grave about. Solomon's projection, prejudice, and gaps in his debatable knowledge about Marx aside, and comments about Marx himself aside, who I critique for his own homophobia, Solomon's polemic versus me is full of strawmen, i.e. the blame the victim, which trans and fat people are under capitalism, while fixating on a narrow, profoundly unuseful definition of Nazi, one more to the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler from nearly a century prior. This interpretation of and deviation from my own arguments by Solomon is an important distinction, so I want to dissect it a bit before we proceed. In Solomon's own words, quote, a Nazi subscribes to Hitler's far-right authoritarian ideology, marked by extreme racism, authoritarianism, and genocidal intent. That doesn't describe Daniel, and so calling him a Nazi is slander, unquote. Timestamp 312. And, in case you don't believe me, here's the quote.
It isn't. A Nazi subscribes to Hitler's far-right authoritarian ideology, marked by extreme racism, authoritarianism, and genocidal intent. That doesn't describe Daniel, and so calling him a Nazi is slander.
Okay. So that's the quote. Concerning said quote, Solomon is incorrect on multiple levels. Most important is how Nazi does not have a single definition, as he purports. And if we click on the image here, it's also worth noting that his image is pulled from Wikipedia, and he gives 3 points, which I'm now going to go over. 1. Nazi, as I use it, is synonymous with fascist, which I will explain more in a moment. Nevertheless, it doesn't exclusively belong to Hitler in the present moment, e.g. neo-Nazis, nor did it in past forms of American fascism while Hitler was alive, e.g. the American Nazi Bund, but also the KKK, and their own neo-medieval orders and terminologies. 2. There are groups comparable to Nazis in function, if not in name. Again, the KKK, Proud Boys, and similar crypto-fascists, but essentially anyone who isn't a flag-waving Nazi, i.e. anyone who has fascist qualities that, for all intents and purposes, are alt-right, ultra-conservative, or otherwise palingenetic ultra-nationalist to varying, but also modular degrees. See Umberto Eco's 14 points. To that, Solomon gives 3 things, 4 if you include Hitler, to define a Nazi. Eco provides 14, but also treats fascism as a global affair that goes well beyond the Germans. These groups also carry different names, i.e., for the same basic ideas borrowed by the Nazis from Italy, chiefly fascism, the word, and the Roman salute, but also American geopolitics' own manifest destiny, e.g., Western chauvinist, race realist, pro-European, and white nationalist, etc., all comporting as fascist through dog whistle and disguise. You can be a Nazi without advertising as one, across the polity of fascist offshoots. 3. Nazi is a broad label that applies to fascist people. It also is a common insult used to describe someone who is strict, i.e. in a variety of ways that aren't comparable to Nazis, e.g. feminazi or grammar Nazi, etc. Indeed, the unironic usage of Nazi plus noun is a common form of Darvo used by people on the alt-right. I'm not the Nazi, you're the Nazi, as well as obscuring what Nazis are through stolen language, a technique called obscurantism, which the Nazis and similar historical forms of fascism were known to do, e.g. the Nazis called themselves National Socialists, which 1. Didn't accurately describe them to start with, and 2. They stole from German leftists who were killed during the German Revolution, but from also Hitler's situational frenemies, the Strasserites, who he later killed after assuming power. In short, Nazis, and by extension all fascists, lie, cheat, and steal as a political modus operandi, making their synonymizing with fascism in general, as well as establishment politics in Western countries, historically apt. However, the legality of calling someone a Nazi also needs to be acknowledged. 4. It isn't a crime in America to call someone a Nazi, not yet anyways, nor anything comparable to a Nazi, e.g. like a certain American hard rock band who just happened to be pro-Confederate above. It also is not a crime to be a Nazi in America. More on this in point 6. 5. It isn't slander in America to call someone a Nazi, insofar as doing so is a matter of opinion, not defamation. i.e., you can't be guilty of doing so because doing so is not a crime. But it also isn't defamation, meaning you can't be liable for it unless the statement is provably false. Again, more on this in point 6. And don't just take my word for it, take it from Noah Sampson, who explains after receiving a letter of intent from accusing Ethan Klein of supporting genocide, for someone to be found liable for defamation, there's a few bars that need to be reached. First, the plaintiff must establish that the allegedly defamatory claim is a statement of fact. Next, that statement of fact must be provably false. It also must have caused demonstrable damage to the plaintiff's finances or reputation. And lastly, the statement has to have been made with actual malice. Actual malice is a legal standard. It's the highest legal standard for defamation claims, and it's only applied to public figures. Basically, it means the defamatory statements have to have been made with the existing knowledge that these statements were false. All of these bars must be met, not just one. 6. Calling someone a Nazi is not the same thing as calling them a criminal or sex offender. See point 4. i.e., someone cannot be arrested in America for being a Nazi or a fascist because both, and all their variations, are a political belief which constitutes free speech. re. To call someone a Nazi is not calling them a criminal, therefore isn't slander according to American law, because Nazis are protected by free speech for their opinions. For instance, Tentinger law, firm writes, quote, an opinion is not considered defamation. The First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech, protects statements of pure opinion from being considered defamation. For example, an online review of a doctor stating the doctor is rude or a jerk is not defamatory. Those are expressions of opinion, but a statement that a person is a criminal or a sex offender, if false, are defamatory. Those are statements of fact that can be proven false. Again, calling someone a Nazi is not the same thing as calling them a criminal, but equivalent in legal terms, that is, to calling them a jerk, asshole, or bigot. It's an opinion, and opinions, by their very nature, are unfalsifiable. You can't prove them true or false because they're subjective and, more to the point, not police speech. In conversational terms, Nazi as I use it equals fascist, but it doesn't strictly equal Hitler and the ideology of the Third Reich. This tragic reduction is Solomon's approach, mine being a far broader and more applicable usage conducive towards universal liberation from capital and its bourgeois superstructure, i.e. my research, a form of opinion, synonymizing Nazi with fash more broadly on a modular spectrum, one that applies to post-Hitlerian examples. Nazi as I use it is purposely broad because it allows for speculative richness, hence people like myself, a trans sex worker and scholar of fascism, to call out bigotry more easily than white moderates classically do. I am an anti-fascist by trade, and Nazi as I use it equals fash, crypto-fascist or not. To reference Eco himself, quote, while Eco is firm in claiming there was only one Nazism, he says, the fascist game can be played in many forms, and the name of the game does not change. So while not all fascists are technically Nazis, and all Nazis are technically fascist, the distinction is frankly moot, i.e. when the whole point of its making is to highlight someone acting fascist at all. Nazi, then, has become imprecise shorthand to identify a broad spectrum of things beyond Hitler and the boys. Keeping all of that in mind, I'm a researcher, educator, who uses Nazi to describe Solomon and Daniel, who are both public figures, specifically YouTubers who were already responding publicly to each other before I weighed in, also on YouTube, for behaving in ways comparable to Nazis, i.e. my "you're a Nazi" statement, which was made by me about both men, effectively being an opinion, one given by a researcher of such things, knowing it cannot be proven true or false the way I am using it. Calling someone a Nazi is not a statement of fact unless something is said that can be proven false, e.g. saying, Daniel has a Nazi flag in his basement, directly to his employer to try and get him fired, which I did not say or do. This would be true even if we use Solomon's definition, except I didn't use Nazi the way he did, ergo his argument is a straw man, and a poor one at that. That's just like your opinion, man. Speaking of which, Nazis classically rely on white moderates who defend them from activism, snobs or otherwise, i.e. in classically medicalized language, amounting effectively to an imperialism of discourse that moderates police and abject the foreign plot peppered by various boogie people. The point is, we're both nerds here, with Solomon, despite his hypocritical statements about my snobbery, effectively the pot who calls the kettle black. Except I'm the nerdy slut here, as are my friend Solomon discounts through his attack on our work. And if you don't believe me, just consider how Solomon constantly talks about elite-level athletes, i.e. to validate himself versus Mike Israetel, while also flaunting his own relative education, alongside his partner, classmate, in the same banner image below. The functional difference between myself and Solomon owes to how Solomon isn't an activist. He's a white moderate who hides his bigotry behind medicalized language, but also nerdy ceremony and regalia, rackets to fleece students with, but also perches to crow from, commonly to announce, thus advertise, a university's overestimated dick size. This image is taken directly from Solomon's YouTube page, specifically their banner image. Beyond graduation ceremonies, Solomon says he's a law-abiding citizen, that doctors aren't cops, and not all cops are bad, etc. No mention of genocide, e.g. the Palestinians. It's the white moderate handbook used from Jim Crow onwards, i.e. to maintain peace as a white man's word in a white man's world, which Martin Luther King called the presence of negative justice during the absence of tension. The difference is dialectical material function. Through my achievements, labor, and output, I marry African American civil rights, activism, to queer people, disabled folk, and minority sex workers, etc. Crowing his own achievements, Solomon ignores centuries of abuse from doctors serving the profit motive, as cops do, e.g., classically white male doctors calling women hysterical while lobotomizing them, or committing them to mental institutions, also called hospitals, whilst also sterilizing indigenous peoples, people of color, while attacking fat people and trans people as doctors also do. Rioting is the voice of the unheard, said Martin Luther King, and doctors commonly sterilize that versus finding consensus versus capitalism, i.e. as the source for so much widespread harm, including genocide whitewashed by moderates, male or not, white or not, dead souls, dead generations, dead wars, dead planets. Mad science is mad medicine. To it, Solomon never challenges my calling him a white moderate, nor does he provide any evidence for his rebuttals beyond the regular approach white moderates abuse, calling my statements false, i.e. as a position to assign by an in-group member styling himself logical from Aristotle onwards, yet ignoring the evidence all around him. He acknowledges genocide, yet does nothing to critique it or billionaires, i.e. by insisting how the world can never change beyond what it currently is. He'll denounce individual cases of overt mask-off fascism and bigotry, e.g. homophobia, but not the status quo that leads criminologically to such things on a global level, i.e. billionaires, presidents, and military leaders, but also medical doctors and those playing at medical doctors, unless Solomon is a medical doctor, but if so, he's still not exempt from bigotry or criticism. In short, Solomon's arguments uphold and demonstrate capitalist realism per a medicalized Protestant ethic, one quick to dismiss the entirety of my evidence, and largely through a transphobic and fatphobic lens calling us dubious, e.g. ADAB. All doctors are bad, from ATAC, Issue 9, February 2024. As part of my trans woman history, working alongside fat people, specifically fat sex workers like Sinead below, towards fat universal liberation versus partial clemency, which might moderates attain and uphold across all registers. Solomon's a pedantic gatekeeper policing omolists, and silence through selective arguments doesn't help his case when called out. The rest of this script shall explore Solomon's white moderacy, a medical aesthetic per capitalist realism, i.e., in my professional opinion, as a trans educator and sex worker activist, having worked with fat people in the past, or my book series being about capitalist realism, specifically sex workers liberating themselves through iconoclastic art, as someone critiquing a public figure talking about other public figures while being a public figure herself. Will also extend my critique of Solomon's moderate fatphobia to other bigotries as well. Critiquing Solomon's response. Through our aforementioned realism, Solomon overlooks systemic bigotries, i.e., not just within the medical industry and its own industrial complex harming fat people and various minorities, but other industries doing the same, e.g. the Vitruvian body standard coming from Eugene Sandow as part of the Nazi American sponsoring of the modern Olympics, thus the bodybuilding industry's conspicuously eugenics-flavored ethnocentric white supremacist body logic, re the obese slur in BMI, which Solomon refuses to critique while calling my sources dubious. In doing so, he's showing his ass, which is to say his privilege and bias, i.e., he fails to address how my critiques borrow from fat people, meaning workers accustomed to hearing obese being used in a medical setting that is harmful unto itself, re. ADAB, but also those who gave me ADAB to read, not to abolish all doctors, period, but the medical profession tied to profit, which the acronym refers to. Despite its dubious medical usage, obese remains a slur of functionality because it comes from a model of measurement, BMI, that is unto itself classically racist, ableist, and prone to misuse against different target minorities, i.e. from the Enlightenment and Cartesian Revolution onwards, thinking beings versus extended beings, the latter of nature as things to measure and destroy by scientist men of reason, / the European colonial order, out of the past into the present. Ari Patel and Moore's A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. Fat is just another symptom and casualty of that order under capital as statuesque, embodied by men like Solomon, i.e. as of the West, their ontological arguments vying for symmetry as unnatural, man-made, and harmful while cheapening other forms of life and labor. White moderates champion white supremacy as dogma to raise and flaunt in naked disguise, i.e. the cryptonomy process. I'm not neutral, I'm just posing next to a marble pillar. The West is their J.O. crystal. A double standard to levy against people like myself, playfully noting whatever homosocial qualities men like Solomon enjoy, arbitrate, their selective enjoyment, whose physical and vocal impunity colonizes such spheres during reactive abuse, meting out collective punishment through pick-and-choose cases. Nerds are automatically for the state, but white cishet male nerds classically tone police nerd culture, and female non-white slutty and or GNC nerds, i.e. through an apex of privilege haunted by embarrassing realities. Charge up in J.O. 38 Houston, date 2008-04-28. Quote, The crystal I wear around my neck contains an essence that gets recharged when I jack it with a bro who also has a crystal. It gives me confidence at work, home, social situations, etc. Nobody knows it's a J.O. crystal but me and my bros. I have seen it glow white while jerking it with a bud. That's how I know this is real. You can come over for as long as you want, but I need a picture of you, preferably wearing a crystal before I waste my time. Oh. Just give me a second. Okay. People are media, which commonly communicate virtues like strength and health, which medicine is, in patriarchal forms flowing into ethnocentric ones, i.e., across a polity of registers conducive to policing bodies of a neoliberal, superheroic stature, health as a venue to police across and inside-outside itself, meaning on poetically similar territories while using body language as a symbol of status about health and knowledge, but also health as sex symbols useful to status and profit, e.g. video game characters, but also doctors, i.e. any who present, whether on purpose or not, as outrageously physical, Plato, whose name means broad shoulders, from the original historical past, but also men who strive to appear cut from the same poetic cloth. Strength and knowledge as synonymous, working as a shield wall for state enforcers pimping iconoclastic horrors by shaming them in different moderate ways versus reactionary gag orders and physical abuse. That's the ruse at play through Solomon's argument, one he vocalizes through various means while discrediting me and my friend's work, but specifically our intellectual outreach voiced through sex work as a whole. All the while, Solomon handwaves any testimony about the obese slur abused by medical professionals while stating that's not what he meant or how he used it when discussing the profession, except a slur is a slur, and the history and testimony of fat people remains the same, i.e. regardless of where the slur is used. And if you don't believe me, try the same trick with the N-word, a classically medicalized term per plantation dialogues, and see where that gets you, Solomon. specifically Negro. The point is, slurs often derive out of medical usage to control marginalized populations, i.e. through medical misuse, and statistical abuse, often through the under-reporting of necrometrics or over-reporting of crime statistics, e.g. homosexual having a medicalized purpose versus sodomite, R.E. Foucault, but which doesn't strictly factor as a slur across the board unless being shortened to homo, because it has been relatively reclaimed versus the N-word, either version, but can still be a slur if used in a police-like way, as transsexual is, e.g. transmedicalists, but also transphobia as rooted in biological essentialism, which doctoral canon of a regressive sort maintains. In other words, doctors in their entire language have a class, culture, and race character to them, i.e. like all workers do, the entirety existing in praxial opposition, therefore duality as a dialectical material concern. So while the obese slur has been reclaimed but rejected by the fat community viewing it as slur, one currently being used, policed by bigoted medical professionals saying prove it to their victims, the gaslight being bedside manner, it also has a medical history to it. The various histories, these various words, in part exist out of sync, but frequently synergize within a larger bailiwick serving the same profit motive, i.e. to different imperfect degrees that intersectional solidarity must address from inside outside different marginalized groups, meaning from allies as much as direct recipients across a holistic pedagogy of the oppressed. Said pedagogy suffers doctors as bad faith, but also privileged actors who cause harm, on purpose or not. They're not gods, but prudish darlings to figuratively kill by critiquing them, showing them our aegis. In turn, recipients of these false gods, tone deafness, and its good or bad intentions, unite in sexually descriptive ways, e.g. black bodies overlap with fat bodies, and sex work advertising idiosyncratic oppression with intersecting voices, speaking collectively on the various ways the state polices workers, one and all, through modular bigotries. None of these words are equal, but their slur statuses nonetheless determined by the people on the receiving end, i.e. of their medical, police-like usage, arbitrated through official or stochastic flavors, furthering abjection on the aegis. When the man comes around, we show him ours and let him hoist himself on his own petard. The Gothic trope of ignominious death. You treat us like chattel, food, and sex toys. About that, ultimately I would implore a degree of awareness from Solomon, but he and many doctors insist how context invariably trumps opinion, i.e. regardless if a word is perceived as slur or not, because they didn't mean it as such. Ergo, according to them, it cannot be viewed as such, i.e. when they use it a particular way on a particular register viewed from elsewhere. But that's historically not how the perception and reception of slurs work, with moral panics tied as much to medical doctrine and legislation as popular media, or vice versa, e.g. Foucault's homosexual man, a juridical subject who, from 1870 onwards, had become a separate species, re. Understanding Vampires, quoting a history of sexuality. To it, doctors, but especially non-marginalized doctors, tend to be extraordinarily tone-deaf. In turn, they go on to historically tone police others who call them out for their clumsy use of language, i.e. similar to lawyers, they behave with immunity as privileged members of a police state that weaponizes doctors against their patients, willing or otherwise. The fact remains Solomon is a YouTube educator of medical information, one whose audience goes beyond he and his fellow straight men, e.g. myself as someone who hears the word obese and is triggered by it, i.e. from my own research and work alongside other marginalized workers, my friends. History shows how fatphobia, racism, and homophobia ultimately aren't separate then or now, which includes medieval history and Protestant revivals, i.e. of gluttony arguments foisted onto conversational spheres with puritanical medicalized flavors, instead overlapping through the usual medicalized abuse seen in bodybuilding and its neighboring fields, leading into regular conversation, doctors act superior in white moderate ways, e.g. Solomon smirking for the camera when I call him out for not addressing Daniel's homophobic language, his smug face condescending while caught out, and me basically having to twist his arm for him to say some fairly uncontroversial things, which he reluctantly and sardonically does, my translation, Of course I think homophobia is bad. That goes without saying. In other words, I'm not fat-shaming, I'm diagnosing. His face. These aren't mutually exclusive, my dude, and you're not as slick as you think you are. The pimp monopolizing nerdiness for you and yours, not we sluts. Doctors seldom blame capital, but rather capital's victims, i.e. as people to scapegoat through personal responsibility, the refrain of neoliberalism, despite everything the state forces upon us, i.e. you are what you eat, including food and drugs, but also diets of simulacra. Ari, Plato's copy of that which never existed, agricores. With egg on his face, Solomon doesn't say mea culpa and move on. He uses his omission to shield himself against criticism, not as something to educate people about bigotry with ahead of time, but a handy excuse to explain his own silence post hoc. It's a shaming device that deflects minority voices, which I am, being a trans woman who works alongside other minorities, i.e. a coercive tactic written all over his straight white face above. I'm a smarty pants, and my intellectual status doesn't just trump fat people's feelings experience, but reality itself. It's a force of will, insisting fat isn't healthy, while ignoring the detriments of that capitalism forces through genocide. R.A. Marx's Capital, quote, capital is dead labor which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor, unquote, which I critique in vampiric language. See Understanding Vampires. Ergo, Solomon sucks. He's the vamp without the camp, bleeding his followers dry by keeping mum yet courting his own reflection, viewed in other men who apologize to him and his ilk, R.A. Daniel apologizing to Solomon's friend Lyle, not to queer people as a whole. Bias is bias, silence genocide by virtue of capitalist realism dehumanizing the harvest, workers in nature, as doctors do. To it, Solomon is often quite vocal through medical language that he hides behind, doing so to achieve said realism, i.e. which he lionizes for simply being neutral, hence something for him to abuse with impunity, despite veering off into non-medical slang such as drug pig to insult his opponents, make diagnosis, when such superiority suits him. Few things are as controlled as human bodies, and Solomon is part of that. It's also something for minorities, such as black people, to assimilate through imitation, as well as various mass-produced and tolerated drug use, but also rape, e.g. Sean Roden. Yet Solomon spuriously argues that I'm guilty of racism by saying that his arguments apply specifically to white people, i.e. white gym rats, as I call them. He's missing the point, which is how people of color within said system can heed said arguments all they want, but do so within a system for which they must assimilate, and one Solomon is quiet about, i.e. Frantz Fanon's black skin, white mask argument occurring pointedly through a prescriptive body image that imitates the colonizer business model, one rife with medical malpractice, drug abuse, and white supremacy as fat-shaming immodest bodies through modular bigotries that classically intersect as needed. To it, supremacy isn't just mask-off fascism, but moderate forms of advocacy by white actors like Solomon, i.e. fat-shaming through the obese slur and BMI, i.e. people who share his views are relatively white supremacist, meaning on a spectrum by virtue of statuesque arguments that Solomon and his friends make through a larger body dialectic, correct bodies versus incorrect bodies, which includes skinny versus fat having its own healthy, unhealthy, and black-white dichotomy that is profoundly racist, doctors colonize, and, more often than not, largely overblown, riddled with dated colonial stereotypes, forcing fat people to be commonly disbelieved by their own doctors about their own bodies, e.g. mainly Mandy's good fatty versus bad fatty. To it, it's entirely possible that fat people can be healthy despite their excess body weight, but also their blood work alongside a variety of other factors. Even if they aren't, fatphobia remains a bigotry exhibited first and foremost by doctors, which Solomon is suitably acting like by virtue of his own fatphobic cosmetic, something to prescribe through a healthy, thus legitimate body image tied to the Protestant ethic, namely lifting weights, and whose systemic problems he largely overlooks in favor of a billboard body that looks good according to him, i.e. his contempt, specifically for fat bodies, extends to other oppressed groups like drug users, which he visually shames according to a preconceived notion of the healthy but also correct body image, doctors versus drug pig. He's still a bigot, just a white moderate one obsessed with physical fitness to shame fat bodies to a medicalized degree, ipso facto. He doesn't have to state, "I hate fat people," i.e. to effectively belittle them as morbidly obese in no uncertain terms. Dogma is dogma, and doctors shame fat people for profit all the time, i.e. while dressing it up as for our own good, fat or otherwise, e.g. trans people, who they routinely deny health care towards, then claim they're merely following the law. The cop argument. Furthermore, overlooking all of this while various genocides continue to unfold amounts to genocide apologia, which unto itself operates on a gradient of silence and inaction. Salomon's of the shrug your shoulders variety versus outright denial. So does all of fascism. American liberalism follow the same modular approach, i.e. Daniel Pekich is Malcolm X's ravenous wolf, and Solomon Nelson the smiling fox. Analogy source, Speech 1963. They're not to be trusted. They are the enemy of the world. The elite historically materially exploit through capital because both men won't challenge said exploitation enough to prevent it. Solomon in particular doesn't care enough to try once called out, with words like heteronormative, Cartesian, and settler colonial completely outside his normal vocabulary, thus audience, his YouTube videos. For example, Solomon defends the elite when provoked, i.e. including billionaires being part and parcel to similar great men of history, e.g. Bill Gates or Napoleon, which I mentioned according to Solomon's defense of nerds from Daniel Pekich attacking him to begin with. But also their lowly defenders, i.e. Daniel, who needs more than a half-hearted apology to a single person, not entire groups of people he was insulting with his clear and obvious bigotry, for me to humor anything he says. By defending Daniel as Solomon clearly does, but also capitalism and cops, doctors or otherwise, but especially doctors, classically abusing women, whores, people of color and or disabled folks, etc. Solomon's a white moderate who tone polices minority educators to excuse his own relative hand in genocide, playing dumb to partake in what he considers fun. E.g., he treats comedy and artwork, hence all popular media, as the opposite of systemic critique, i.e. calling anything else utopian, therefore impolite, irresponsible, violent, etc. Nothing good ever came on the backdrop of world peace, Solomon says. This is a dog whistle, specifically a neoliberal one apologizing for manufactured conflict, scarcity, and consent. War is good, in Solomon's mind, a perverse and pervasive means of testing one's mettle in a world that cannot exist without it, thus its victims, whores with non-white bodies, insofar as non-white translates to anything immodest, in which prostate doctors muzzle for being fat and sassy. See my arguments on the whore's revenge. Doctors are cops, and the oldest cops of all are pimps, which Cartesian nerds classically are. R.E. Men of reason suck. As such, Solomon functions as a neoliberal, hence cop, through the medicalization of such things, r.e. policing bodies to varying degrees and stigmatized qualities that overlap with other congenital to comorbid disorders, with the body being GNC and ACE, having struggled with their body image for years above. They police fatness as automatically unhealthy despite if it is or not, and despite any unhealthiness having been caused by capital, which doctors don't treat. Per that refrain, Solomon sucks, i.e. again in my professional opinion, r.e. as a sex worker educator outside of academia who, quite often, uses academic phrasing and thesis material to bolster her own statements for educational purposes. These are my own opinions levied against other public figures based on publicly available information, hence art slander as accused by Solomon in his own video, i.e. they are not statements of fact made as knowingly false and with malice, but opinion. Malice doesn't legally apply to opinion, meaning its legal standard regarding public figures, which Solomon and Daniel both are. My YouTube channel description is clear about my educator status below, and I may critique and satirize both men and their allies till the cows come home. Daniel and Solomon suck because capital sucks, and they both uphold it, but Solomon does so to a medicalized white moderate degree. My channel description on YouTube. Quote, Persephone Waard, male to female trans woman, they, them, or she, her, poly, demi, pan, 38, anti-fascist and BDSM author, Gothic communist, sex worker, indie researcher, PhD in Gothic poetics and Ludo-Gothic BDSM, who specializes partly in Metroidvania, erotic artist, pornographic historian, and invigilator. This being said, my educator's standings and approach aren't always obvious in my YouTube videos themselves, but this owes to how said videos are often conversational, loose, not the end-all be-all of my broader work, or in my 6-volume book series on Gothic communism, but something to relax to while giving those I critique, as much time as I feel like. As such, I don't debate Nazis, i.e. fascist people who fall on a modular spectrum of behaviors, beliefs, and projections, re. eco. Again, Nazis are synonymous with fascism at large, hence fall under a broad umbrella that includes white moderates, and certainly doesn't reduce, as Solomon argues, to out-and-out confessed examples from or longing for Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. Hitler was a copycat, stealing from Mussolini, and more to the point, America and its own successful genocides policing workers en masse, i.e. multiple and ongoing hate campaigns that continue into the present, and which doctors assist in by aiding the profit motive. So if someone like Daniel Pekich says openly and outrageously bigoted shit, I'm going to call it like it is, i.e. by attaching them to the same problematic spectrum, not coddling them or trying to invent reasons to defend them from critique, as Solomon clearly does, despite him vocally recognizing Daniel's fascist undertones. And here's the quote from Daniel from my original video, White Moderates Debating Nazis.
It's so good to have people like Lowell in the industry keeping it real. These are all just losers.
Okay, so they're weak, they're queer, they're degenerates. Okay, how is this refreshing is the first thing that I want to ask. And, there's this... Okay, so that's what Daniel says. That was my response to it. And furthermore, Solomon doesn't actually answer that question, just case in point. So if someone like Daniel Pekich says openly and outrageously bigoted shit, I'm going to call it like it is, i.e. by attaching them to the same problematic spectrum, not coddling them or trying to invent reasons to defend them from critique, as Solomon clearly does, despite him vocally recognizing Daniel's fascist undertones. Life's too short, and we're frankly in the middle of multiple genocides and climate change, resulting from and pursuant to the rise of fascism, which Solomon ignores per capitalist realism, during a white moderate approach lionizing his own worldview is tied suitably enough to the Vitruvian model as fatphobic, therefore racist. Bigots are selective about their body types. Moderates medicalize that bigotry and stigma in neutral language they routinely betray or abuse, however they see fit, with Solomon cherry-picking my arguments to pick and choose his attack versus replying to my queries, e.g. my question, what's refreshing about Daniel's homophobia again, which Solomon never answers. Except there's nothing polite about whitewashing genocide, which is precisely what defending fascism is and what moderates do. Silence is genocide, and Solomon is silent about fat transliberation from the myopic body language and jargon he advertises. Doctors are cops, including de facto doctors coddling fascism's dumber elements, fooled by pictures with colors, including charts, which neoliberals love to use and abuse below. Here's the chart. It's got rainbows. Defending capital through inaction and silence is a grave mistake, one that white liberals like Solomon reliably make while failing to meaningfully challenge fascism, the party of law and order whose silent majority, from Nixon onwards, blames the victim for dividing and conquering themselves, versus capital demonstrably having done so for centuries, i.e. in a Cartesian thus medical dialectic that favors straight white men and their systems of power, again alienizing fat folk, people of color with non-white bodies through BMI, and trans people as equally policed through doctors too. And if Solomon wants to prove me otherwise, he need only vocalize how billionaires suck, as well as capitalism and the Enlightenment, modernity per the Cartesian model abusing workers in medicalized language, i.e. is illustrated by the very athleticism he attacks in one breath and defends in another while punching down politely against other sex, gender, and body types, i.e. nature is monstrous feminine, alien, criminal, sick, other. Again, according to Solomon, it's my and academia's fault that capital exploits workers, essentially raping them, my argument. In short, he's complicit, which goes beyond his medical language and aesthetic alone, e.g. his touting of various logical word games, working on par with new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens' own sexism, ableism, racism, and Islamophobia, but also Rationality Rules' own transphobia, i.e. as having medicalized elements that routinely play out through the same rhetorical tricks, ludology, next page, a medical aesthetic used by Solomon, e.g. Essence of Thoughts, Rationality Rules screws up science on trans athletes again. And also, just to clarify here, when I say essentially raping them, I'm speaking about how capital exploits workers, which Solomon apologizes for through his white moderate arguments. I'm not accusing Solomon of rape, but apologizing for capital, which does rape workers. To it, bigotry is bigotry by virtue of function, not aesthetic, and white straight men with a medical bias don't have monopolies on any of these things, treating our survival, speaking out, as a game they can monopolize. Cartesian thought can a Cartesian thought, abstaining from what they kettle and destroy by depriving medicalized peoples of their voice, thus autonomy, e.g. doctors and patients, but also gamers. Think Magic the Gathering or Pokemon, but lamer, and more racist and fat. Here's the card game. It has a variety of logical devices, the very kind that Solomon uses, and specifically it's from a YouTube video by Rationality Rules. Again, cops can be nerds, and police through nerd culture, e.g. like Solomon does against moi. This includes Solomon's flat refusal to engage with my argument's content, calling everything illogical because I mistrust his usage of such things. Ari, he doesn't challenge my statements about his white moderacy defending Daniel as fascist ipso facto, but does blame me for society's woes, i.e. instead of doctors for profit and the medical industry having fatphobia and racist elements, what fascism is known for, calling them useless eaters historically. Instead, I'm simply hysterical, false, alien, all labels assigned by white moderates who dress these insinuations up, effectively saying we're asking for it by prognosis. As such, I'm gatekept by the usual gatekeeper type as white, straight, and male, i.e. specifically doctors by virtue of action, therefore function, protecting Omelis from its own scapegoats less by controlled opposition and more sedation through argument. So are patients kept prisoner while crying in the cellar for a chance to be heard. Furthermore, white moderates commonly disguise their language as reason itself, a thing to defend from assigned agents of falsehood, which, wouldn't you know it, are capital's usual victims, existing on a gradient of oppression and privilege, i.e. Solomon presents himself as using those superior devices while implying I do not, making him moderately transphobic and poetically averse in the bargain. Of course, far worse things have been done using the same exact language and devices, i.e. medicalized cryptonomy furthering abjection by doctors to greater and greater degrees of genocide, i.e. euthanasia, extermination, neutralization, development, civilization. This goes for land and labor alike, sexualizing the entire planet as alien, trolley problems calling genocide progress, i.e. Howard Zinn. But in making the world inhospitable for their patients, doctors still enjoy the usual perks given by the state, i.e. as petit bourgeois agents of control, alienated from nature as something the state polices to assimilative degrees. Logic isn't superior to madness, my dudes. Guerrilla warfare proves that fact time and time again, as does the numinous, i.e. the quest for power. Dressed up in medicalized cryptonomy, reversing abjection, this goes for land and labor alike. Systemic issues aside, Solomon achieves his scapegoat through Darvo arguments that apologize for Daniel's fascist tendencies, i.e. that I'm the reason society is divided, versus, I don't know, capitalism as a historical material system of division? I argue for solidarity among the oppressed, not the oppressors acting in bad faith. Solomon says I'm a hypocrite, ostensibly owing to how my teamwork omits Nazis, meaning fascism are those who debate fascist people, i.e. Solomon. Bitch, please. I can argue for teamwork while excluding harmful parties from a larger team, i.e. ACAB, and doctors or cops, team proletariat versus team bourgeoisie, the latter which Solomon aids or sides with by refusing to critique great men of history like Napoleon, Bill Gates, Alexander the Great, and so on. That comparison flew right over his swollen head. As a Gothic ludologist and encom sex worker trans woman who works with fat people and other minorities, I find Solomon's idea of teamwork to be woefully anemic and harmful, i.e. whose exclusionary brand deliberately omits me and my friends, relegating teamwork to a white moderate's establishment idea of playing ball with state forces to serve state masters, i.e. Solomon docking with Daniel, which frankly sounds like an excellent TV show. Again, us versus them equals abjection, which class, culture, and race war can further or reverse to aid/disrupt profit. i.e. capitalism alienates and sexualizes everything to defend or abjure according to all the usual phobias and their arguments, states' rights versus worker rights, the horror reducing harm during Budo-Gothic BDSM, namely public nudism, to remind state doctors what they have forgotten. Hence, drawing from Solomon's various connotative factors, a process of observation, hence inference and deduction, versus just quoting him, he blames me for the failures of the left, in effect blaming everyone I've ever worked with for what neoliberalism has achieved through empty words, the latter falling flat as fascism comes home to roost, i.e. while Solomon largely reduces state decay to a historical footnote, re. Hitler's Germany. You'd think fascism simply didn't exist then, i.e. by how calmly Solomon stares at the script and talks about his pet project, bodybuilding, as something to discuss, despite genocide happening all around him, as I point out, meaning his fixation with bodybuilding and its fascist elements / actors, taking up whatever language he could use to discuss those topics vis-a-vis genocide, i.e. something he refuses to do for fear of, in his own words, reversing course. For Solomon, that's what talking about genocide amounts to. The way I see it, Solomon views discussing genocide, period, as the opposite of what he's currently about, but also those like him, doctors or cops, fascist or otherwise, a capital breeds such things to prey on all things different from the status quo, i.e. nature as degenerate, e.g. the Nazis raiding Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexology in 1933. Silence is genocide, including when you devote your voice to something far less important. Discussing genocide for purposes of universal liberation far outweighs discussing bodybuilding to ignore history repeating itself. As such, cops infiltrate, destroying people to defend property by design, re. the great man of history argument that Solomon is making and refuses to critique, acting like a pimp instead, but a smugly white moderate one. Again, he doesn't slap or detonate me, the bare minimum, I must confess. He simply rolls his eyes when I note his inability to critique Bill Gates, Napoleon, Alexander the Great, Daniel Pekich, and so on. It's a very low bar, an odd hill to die on, but die Solomon does. For him, they simply are, and he can't see how he's like those men too, i.e. insofar as he'll apologize for state force, with written spoken argument, as much as military weaponry, defending the nuclear model as center of the universe. Think of it as Plato's cave, which Solomon can't think beyond while inside. Thus he'll happily tone police the trans whore educator, working with fat folk and other minorities, insisting I'm not actually on the left because I'm a snob and rude bitch, i.e. And again, in my words, he doesn't call me a rude bitch, but he does call me a snob, i.e. to call a fash in a quickie YouTube video where frankly politeness isn't owed or expected. Yet Solomon still thinks that I should be polite, e.g. by deferring to the himbo meathead, openly spouting homophobic slurs and attacking intellectualism by his own confession and Solomon's. It's not ableism to call someone a bit dumb, based on their arguments and physical appearance, i.e. Nazis rely on appearances to communicate their arguments. R.E. Daniel Pekich looks and sounds stupid for an aesthetic with an anti-intellectual function, one Solomon calls a war on nerds, which implies white, straight, politically conservative nerds like Solomon, while excluding slutty, radical ones like me. It's very boundaries for me, not for thee, of Solomon. To it, not only has politeness towards Nazis never historically worked, see The Greatest Generation, but to defend a bigot is to be a bigot yourself, i.e. a white moderate is a Nazi with more masks of a specific type, but also falsehoods. It's not ableist to call someone dumb, Solomon, i.e. based on how they look and sound as a matter of performance of theater and kayfabe, comedy and drama. Ha ha, gay, so refreshing. This is sarcasm, with me calling Solomon out for, again, not meaningfully addressing Daniel's homophobia before or after my response to him. They'll blow each other as bodybuilders, but not the whistle, their ears deaf to the siren's cries, her macaroni stirring sounds. Jesting aside, Solomon remains curiously more forgiving of men with fascist tendencies than minorities with communist ones. Likewise, both sizing Daniel and myself is a false equivalency unto itself. Except Solomon doesn't even do that. He defends poor little Daniel from the big, bad, false leftist, I'm abject, false, alien, untrustworthy, and so on. In short, Solomon defends the bigot and projects his school of arguments onto me and mine, showing subliminal images of Mike Israetel as he does, who I don't even agree with, stand for, i.e. by making the very anti-intellectual statements of exposing snobbery that fascists are known for. It's frankly sus, white moderates like Solomon prone to the self-same devices that capital requires of them, i.e. as it does of fascist actors. One side is reactionary, and the other is moderate. Both are bigots insofar as they defend capital, as a system of bigotry with medicalized elements unkind to different minority groups under capitalist realism. Salomon's just fancier in his language than Daniel is, but fatphobic, racist, transphobic, and whorephobic, all the same. He can't just erase that by denying it. I've given plenty of evidence for him to contend with, including this essay, but also the fascism and genocide occurring all around us. All in all, white moderates defend fascists, and fascists sometimes defend white moderates, both defending capital hand in hand for centuries. Neither challenges capital, but both blame capital's systemic harm on capital's victims, e.g. trans people, educators or not, being tone policed by white, cishet moderates and their bigoted outcomes, or like Solomon's using of the obese slur while calling the trans woman racist for academically isolating Solomon's audience as predominantly white at its ideological core/function, i.e. regardless of any visually non-white audience members or gym goers. Assimilation is assimilation, e.g. Ronnie Coleman belonging to a systemically racist institution on multiple registers, the bodybuilding circuit and police state victimizing him, then calling it immortality. The ego lifts certainly didn't help. To it, the medical profession and nuclear model had a hand in what Ronnie stood for and encouraged among future athletes chasing the same pinnacle, judged by white systems of power and the uniforms worn by black athletes in the flesh that white people fetishize. Victor Frankenstein was a Cartesian dickwad who made monsters to crow his own genius. So too does the medical industry and its various offshoots treat us few black men as beastly freaks of nature to crown. King Kong is a nod to Frankenstein and the slave trade, capturing specimens from far-off lands, but also made out of spare parts, black magic, and cultural appropriation, e.g. the Gollum legend. It's not racist to observe racist allegory in popular media, on stage and off. It is racist to ignore it on purpose for capitalist realism. Racism punches down. The same goes for all bigotries, Solomon. Our survival isn't your utopia to police. We are not automatically sick, degenerate, unhealthy, or useless, and our consent is sexy versus the medical profession demonizing it, gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss. However allergic or selective the elite's paradoxes are, we embody them to set ourselves free from state, thus doctor control, and no amount of rejection or declaration of our falseness by white straight nerds personifying Rome and its own conspicuous follies can deny said existence. We thrive in spite of your crumbling empire. Reason is a Morton's fork, suffering its own trolley problems for once, i.e. when we deny our predators the usual forbidden fruit. No pussy for you. We control our own chubby cum dumps. Thank you very much. Speaking of which, so do we whores have our revenge against prophets, reactionaries, and white moderates, i.e. if we didn't have power to start with, they wouldn't try to steal that power by fetishizing us, and it's the paradox of said power that may turn against them, and capital's built-in contradictions during the whore's revenge, re on the aegis as reversing such things, anisotropically and in duality during dialectical material scrutiny's liminal expression. Such things are harder to ignore than words, I find. A vanishing point, quote, on the ashes of something not quite present, unquote. Our castles in the flesh short-circuit capital by laying truth in our revenge bare. Like most doctors in general, Solomon lacks the language to effectively critique us, at least not without exposing their own bigotry and ignorance. In short, someone skipped leg day. Solomon doesn't have a leg to stand on. We profane state virtue. We whores profane state virtue by existing in spite of it. The Gorgon, a fat and sassy disruptor standing on her own death on two legs. re the Gothic, neo-medieval hyphenation, what Bodrick might call inherited confusions of sex and war, voyeurism and exhibitionism, free love, and Amazon's heavy artillery, toe-to-top full of direst cruelty. Rower. Abashed, the devil stood. This entire section is basically impossible to show uncensored on Blogger, thus YouTube. Go to my Not Safe for Work version of this post to see it in its entirety. Here's an exhibit of our doing so, using what we got to reverse the very objection furthered by Solomon and the entire medical profession. Solomon says obese isn't a slur because of where he uses it, except a slur is a slur by virtue of its usage, thus function, e.g. my straight sibling saying faggot in his car, but telling me about it, versus Solomon saying obese to his friends, which I catch wind of and respond to as victims of the medical industry. To it, we sluts celebrate ourselves versus people like you snobbily treating us like disease, the pimp's refrain. I.e., as you celebrate the very world order, brutalizing workers through eating disorders, body dysmorphia, called muscle dysmorphia with bodybuilders, and gender dysphoria made congenital, i.e., we're products of our environment fed to us, which we must challenge through what the state and doctors control vis-a-vis socio-material conditions, e.g. women's bodies, non-white bodies, gay bodies, and bodies doing sex work as paid, unpaid. Who's the savage? Modern man. This isn't my opinion alone, but my friends' opinion too, i.e. through their bodies, but also their words associated with said bodies reclaiming the base and recultivating the superstructure, e.g. my partner Rob, who read this essay only to give feedback afterwards. Quote, here's a really good article on Waard, and then on top of that, people on antidepressants, antipsychotics, birth control, any number of meds are screwed, plus the corruption of the sugar industry in the U.S., plus inaccessibility of nutritional education and healthcare, plus popularity of crash diets and dangerous surgeries, plus genetics all contribute to obesity. Being fat isn't a moral failing, it's a consequence of human diversity, epigenetic factors, and a sociological environment. But yeah, being fat puts you at risk of certain things. Certain things also put you at risk of being fat. It's something to be aware of, but is morally neutral, and is basically as morally significant as living in certain zip codes, which can also impact length of life. All those things are sociological and not really individual beyond the health consequences that individual people experience, and even then, it certainly comes down to a lack of understanding, lack of certain resources in spite of abundance of others, and just sheer luck and sure, maybe a few personal factors, but that's in the minority. Unquote. Keeping that in mind, the medical industry and its tentacles are things to protect against, which extends to different vulnerable groups targeted by medical interference and obstruction, i.e. topics for which we haven't had time to discuss here much, if at all, i.e. trans people such as myself and my friends in person, with my fat ass, love weight, reminding folks that you don't need to be sculpted to pull a baddie, below. But also other trans couples, intersex people, disabled indigenous people, disabled Americans, agender people, parents, plural people, survival sex workers, and cis-queer sex workers, straight sex workers of color. Nothing is more policed than sex, which bodies, but especially non-white, female, and feminine trans emasculated bodies are. Their nudity is violent, insofar as the state will treat it as such, doing so on par with Hayes and Cava's description, and one I have used convergently in my own work. Quote, they will call you violent. If your tactics disrupt the order of things under capitalism, you may well be accused of violence, because violence is an elastic term often employed to vilify people who threaten the status quo. Conditions that the state characterizes as peaceful are in reality quite violent. Even if people experience the violence of poverty, the torture of imprisonment, the brutality of policing, the denial of health care, and many other violent functions of this system, we are told we are experiencing peace, so long as everyone is cooperating. When state actors refer to peace, they are really talking about order, and when they are referring to peaceful protest, they are talking about cooperative protest that obediently stays within the lines drawn by the state. The more uncooperative you are, the more you will be accused of aggression and violence. It is therefore imperative that the state be not the arbiter of what violence means among people seeking justice. Unquote. Source, Let This Radicalize You, 2023. Solomon called himself a law-abiding citizen, but peace is a white man's word. Bodies are like books, and how the state will ban, thus burn and invade them as it would any other territory to maintain itself and its monopolies. There is always another castle, and ours, in the flesh or otherwise, is always illegitimate versus state doubles. To exist for workers is to survive, solidarize, and speak out in the shadow of such liminalities. Our existence is the protest, which happens through decentralized second-nature ways that overwhelm state enforcers pimping whores as workers of the world, unpaid or paid. Nudity is an ancient form of protest and strength, dating back to the ancient Greeks and Amazons, but extending towards modernity and its twilight years. Bare bodies are like the raised fist in that respect, and porn is art, is education, is power. So stare and tremble. We whores are not culprits, nor things to fix, cure, or diagnose. Like callous doctors playing God, we subvert the vaudeville, myths, and censorship of medicine, our morphological variety, the spice of life, not its bane. E.g., how disabled people somehow can't experience sexual pleasure, therefore desire, i.e. by reclaiming it themselves from state forces, with Connie Panzerinos, trach dykes eat pussy without coming up for air, dating back to the early 90s, but disabled POC and GNC rebellions reaching back to Stonewall 1969, and indeed long before it, to the Neo-Gothic era, the actual medieval period, and the ancient canonical codes of antiquity, R.E. Foucault. For every state law, there must also be state victims to disproportionately police, i.e. made objection, thus performances that protest such things reversing said objection. Objection equals profit, rape, genocide. We horrors protest genocide with our bodies, revolutionary cryptonomy. By comparison, doctors are typically elite employees, generally well paid and raised on hierarchy like all cops and the state, but who enjoy the added veneer of medical practitioner to shield themselves with. Such exceptions must be abolished if we are to survive, therefore evolve beyond state operations, i.e. capitalist realism, as Solomon's white liberal posturing maintains, effectively dressing up Cartesian, therefore secular colonial and heteronormative division and barbarities. Oppression is achieved through Darwin obscurantism, the oppressor acting oppressed when they are anything but. For the actual oppressed, liberation is all or nothing, a larger movement that challenges oppression as a structure. Those who contribute to its continuation are cops, thus not our friends, i.e. because they abuse the paradox of tolerance to guilt their critics into automatically including them. Inclusion of the oppressor, regardless of disguise or lack thereof, is merely a form of confession, therefore segregation is waiting to happen, i.e. from them to us, regardless of which, victims of cops must reject cops, for they overlook our destruction without a second thought. In other words, doctors moralize and medicalize secular language, i.e. that upholds the Protestant ethic through capitalist realism, robbing us blind. Capital can only take, giving back what it has already stolen before taking it again and again and again. Under capital, all work is sexualized to some degree. Medusa is the ghost of the counterfeit to cage by force. Anything that frees her is therefore alien, treated by the men behind the curtain, the elite, as criminal, which the usual doctors in front of the curtain will police. R.E., as Solomon does, smugly dismissing the entirety of my work and that of my friends, 6 books and various interviews, essays, and exhibits, and so on. When confronted with genocide, Solomon chooses to focus on his leisurely activities, all while treating ours as antithetical to reason, critique, and anything else. The Gorgon to behead, a peach to cut up. It's lamentable, but hardly a shock. Except Solomon's praxically inert, a critical void that sucks his victims dry, R.E. Marx, and all to monopolize the proceedings. We paradoxically nerdy whores turning our noses and asses up at him. He's no god, but Ozymandias, in small, colonizing the globe by refusing to critique capital when faced with its abuse. Our bodies are merely mirrors that turn him to stone, freeing Mother Earth from state control. Man back, labor back, sex back, danger disco, meson and bime. The chronotope is much the human body as it is house and home in Gothic. Make no mistake, to rebel is dangerous, but we're already in danger, and who says that has to be dull? We're the earth, rejecting capital's typical abjection, moderate or otherwise. So when the man comes around, show him your aegis versus giving into his taken from you, i.e. your numinous booty, a part of nature is monstrous feminine, stolen by the state to shame nature with. So hijack the process in reverse, i.e. humanize the harvest, exposing the state as inhumane. Methinks the lady doth protest too much? Protest this. We fat, gay, non-white faggot whores, with harmony being agender below, seize the means of production. What doctors police as nature in small, fearful of past wrongs, closing the door to future exploitation. Is it in yet? Exit only, bitch. We're the great destroyer, avenging not just capital's theft against us, but generations of whores flaunting the very rejection you call fear, genocide, i.e. capitalist realism, a world where whores refuse to obey pimps, passing the torch along towards fatal homecoming, commonly through sex as an asexual discourse through public nudism, the capital abjects along double standards, e.g. male nudity versus female or intersex. Our lineage is one of whorish pride, showing rebel asses versus weird dorks like Daniel and Solomon, upholding the status quo with their clothes on. Nothing is more policed than sex, including fat bodies or bodies treated as fat, queer, and or non-white. To achieve poetic justice for these groups, you need a pedagogy thereof. You need slutty poetry and or theater nerds reclaiming power for workers, not a logic nerd policing bodies for the state. We whores hit the spot then, getting our enemies and their erasure of us and ransom of our health and their means of medicine on the hip. Conclusion and postscript. To conclude my critique, in doing so as a trans educator and activist who has independently published her PhD as part of a larger book series meant to challenge capital, in ways Solomon demonstrably does not, this matter is hardly a debate. For one, we're well and truly past debating if climate change, genocide, and fascism in America or elsewhere are real. 2, I refuse to argue with anyone who has, whether they meant to or not, shown me their entire bigoted ass. You did so through your words, while I draw from my past portfolio for a more literal interpretation of that phrase. A commie booty, fighting fire with fire, the oppressed punching up against bigotry, using what she's got. For my will is as strong as yours, and my kingdom as great. You have no power over me. In more orthographic terms, my previous declaration about Solomon remains entirely unshaken, i.e. that he, Solomon Nelson, is a white moderate who happily defends, however lazily, bigoted men like Daniel, but also entire medicalized systems of oppression attached to billionaires and cops, effectively making him a cop ipso facto, in which fascism, thus Nazis, are ACAB, ABAB, ASAB, Free Palestine, but also all areas and peoples affected by capital as white and straight, i.e. those whose white, powerful straight men, for whom de facto cops like Solomon refuse to meaningfully criticize. So if they hear all doctors are bad and scoff, they're overlooking the systemic critique attached to such positions by oppressed groups, i.e. the former bought and paid for by capital, which abuses fat and trans people, among other groups treated as unhealthy in doctors' eyes too. To that I won't debate Solomon in a conversational setting, because I don't currently trust him, i.e. to not belittle or present me as hostile, misguided, or confused, etc., the Amazon to study and cattle. So I'll merely present him as an object lesson instead, i.e. one concerning white moderacy and supremacy in the bodybuilding industry as demonstrably toxic. That being said, I will happily engage in talks, but only to teach him, i.e. about the holes in his own education, provided he's willing to listen. If so, then groovy. Otherwise, this script is all he's getting. Go read my books if you want more. Regarding those, Marx is my stepping stone, and one I critique alongside a variety of straight white men, R.E. Solomon Nelson as a moderately fatphobic, transphobic example. And if that sounds far-fetched, consider how defending capital by calling communism and its development utopian is, unto itself, a pernicious and common form of bigotry dressed up as logical, i.e. a form of Red Scare treated as essential, therefore beyond reproach to the same degree of smug certainty Solomon applies to everything. And yet logic and madness are, similar to medicine, an aesthetic to weaponize for different goals, and Solomon's defense of profit is, ironically enough, part of a larger system, for profit, that poisons the very gym-goers he professes to love. First, do no harm, and capital and capitalist realism are the opposite of health, i.e. plenty of doctors violate their Hippocratic oath for those sweet, sweet dollars, not all to be sure, but enough to continue genocide, as a position to ignore or deny until it is too late. Don't believe me? Beyond myself and my GNC, fat, and non-white friends on the domestic side of the Imperium, look elsewhere. Ask the men, women, and children of Palestine, but also anywhere in the global south, Middle East, and foreign states of exception, echo diametrically on the home front, i.e. that medically verminize outgroup members inside themselves as routine pigs for the slaughter. Doctors of the canonical cop-like sort aren't just pimps, but butchers, obsessed with triage while holding the scalpel in so many ways. And if you still don't believe me, ask pregnant women who have endured cesareans without their knowledge or consent, purely because the hospital found it profitable and or convenient. R.E. nature is monstrous feminine, a living corpse to slice to ribbons mid-panopticon, a machinery for pigs to squash beef. That's what capitalist realism is. Yours, Persephone Vanderwaard. P.S. At the start of the video, the editor presents my statements about Daniel having never been to an academic conference, but whose order, placement, and length of the clip being shown make it seem to my eyes like I'm talking about Solomon. It feels a bit disingenuous. And specifically, this is what I'm referring to. Have you ever been to an academic conference? Don't answer that, I'm sure you haven't. You suck. You're no better than Mike Israetel. Like, you know all these logical fallacies, and you have this debate pro kind of thing, Solomon Nelson does, another red flag. God, you're a Nazi. No wonder you're debating Nazis. You're one of them. Right. So, yeah, there's that. And it's not good editing, unless, I mean, it's good editing insofar as I feel like it's misleading, and if that's the case, well done. But also, I stand by what I said. The dangle's a bit dim. A himbo. Welcome to queer discourse, love. And probably hasn't been to an academic conference in his life, which I mentioned specifically because he, Dangle, says he hates nerds, which again Solomon also acknowledges. And yet, a white straight nerd like Solomon defends Dangle, not me, and all because I was rude for calling Dangle dumb for being anti-nerd, based partly on his looks. While Dangle looks and sounds dumb, I observed as much because his argument and appearance go notably hand in hand, i.e. it was by Dangle's own admission. The nerds are full of shit, a fact Dangle wears proudly on his sleeve. But here Solomon demonstrably ignores those observations by me. I.e. by selecting the ad hominem portion of my words, while treating like my point about his aesthetic, which fascists adhere to, somehow doesn't exist. This selection, I argue, shows exactly where Solomon's loyalties lie, not to the left and its own workers, slutty nerds or otherwise, but someone he admits has fascist undertones that Dangle was very vocal about, or that nerds are weak, stupid, and useless. It's two sides of the same coin, the moderate cop defending the reactionary cop from capital's enemies, women and minorities, but especially educated varieties of these that refuse to tokenize. For Solomon, we're merely apophenic, conspiratorial, something to smirk and ask, what does that have to do with anything? That's not what I was talking about. Except the universe doesn't revolve around you, my dudes. We slutty nerds aren't asking for clemency from you, but to abolish the state and all its cops, nerds, doctors, or otherwise. Also, Daniel was calling everything gay in a homophobic sense, which is still rude and fascist, regardless if Daniel apologizes or not. Apologies aren't useful. Solidarity against the bourgeoisie is. This means challenging cops who serve the elite, an act that requires regular activism, not myopic and half-hearted attempts at clemency to avoid facing facts. The cops, doctors or otherwise, aren't welcome in leftist circles because they play the victim versus actually being victims. You gotta prove yourself to us, Dangle and Solomon, because we're the victims of the system you both defend, one that normally puts people such as yourself, white straight dudes, into positions of authority you use to harm us with. P.P.S. Thank you, Solomon, for your response, despite its numerous and egregious flaws. I don't usually get the chance to flex my muscles like this and talk cathartically about the toxic aspects of bodybuilding as I do, i.e., as something I enjoyed greatly while in the closet, but nowadays think is a tremendously unhealthy and self-serving domain. Rower. So scary. And we have our footnotes here. I'm not going to read all of these, but you can peruse them at your leisure. About the author. Persephone Waard is the author of the multi-volume non-profit book series Sex Positivity, its art director, sole invigilator, illustrator, and primary editor, the other co-writer, co-editor being Bay Ryan. Persephone has her independent PhD in Gothic poetics and Little Gothic BDSM, focusing partly on Metroidvania, and is a male-to-female trans woman, Tolkien and Amazon enthusiast, anti-fascist, atheist, Satanist, polypan-kinkster, erotic artist, pornographer, and anarcho-communist with three partners, actually, at this point, including multiple playmates, friends, and collaborators. Persephone and her many muses play together on sex positivity and on her artwork at large as a sex-positive force. That being said, she still occasionally writes reviews, Gothic analyses, and interviews for fun on her old blog and makes YouTube videos talking about politics. Any money Persephone earns through commissions or donations goes towards helping sex workers through the Sex Positivity Project, i.e. by paying costs and funding shoots, therefore raising awareness. She takes payment on PayPal, Patreon, and Cash App, etc. All links are available on her link tree. Every bit helps. Yeah, so that concludes the essay. And again, this is the safe for work version of the essay. If you want the spicier version, go to the version on my website, which has a lot more nudity on it. None of Solomon Nelson, I should add, but me and my friends, who are all sex workers, critiquing his white moderacy. So yeah, this is the version that I have read, and I obviously won't be reading the Not Safe for Work version. Furthermore, this essay comprises a specific seminar-style approach that I'll be doing in the future. So if I see something that I want to respond to, or someone responds to me and I want to respond to them in an academic way, I will write an essay like this. I don't necessarily know what it's going to be, because the beautiful thing about seminars, which I want to add based on what I said before about Daniel Pekich having never attended a seminar, is that they're fairly conversational. They're an opportunity for members of various communities, either in the humanities and or the STEM fields, to interact with each other, e.g. the International Gothic Association, wherein I've attended multiple conferences in Britain and in the United States, as well as smaller conferences attached to individual universities. So, like, the seminar approach that I'll be using to essentially write essays that I can read on YouTube and promote my larger body of work in safer work ways is unto itself conversational. And Solomon calls it intellectual snobbery. But the thing is you don't even have to be an academic to attend a conference. For instance, the International Gothic Association is open to the public, and all you have to do is pay a fee, and specifically an annual fee, I think, or a membership. Or I think if you don't have that, you can still pay up front, but there are limited numbers of people who can enter. So basically, if you pay the member's fee, you're guaranteed a spot, but that fee doesn't require you to teach at a university. It's just something you pay. And you pay that to also have access to their journals. But by having access to their journals, you also have access to their conferences, which, again, you still have to pay an entry fee even if you're a member of the association, but it's considerably less, and you're basically guaranteed a spot. So I have attended these seminars before, these symposiums, by giving a seminar at the symposium, essentially talking about things that I wanted to write about. And sometimes these things I went on to write about a bit more, like I wrote about Roadside Picnic and the Strugatsky brothers, and it being modified and adopted to film with Stalker, the movie, and Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl, the video game, and the Metro series, and Chernobyl, the series with HBO. So I went on to do that. I've also given a conference talking about, I can't remember, the other conference that I gave, that I attended in person, was in regards to Metroidvania. And there was a third conference that I attended through video call. I wasn't actually able to go to Sheffield because I was in America at this point and I couldn't afford to fly out. But I did record myself giving a talk, and that was also about horror and terror video games comparable to Metroidvania. So again, like these are meant to be like research talks. It's like, hey, I'm going to write about this and I'm going to talk about this. They're not really that different than YouTube videos. The audience is just slightly different. And while the audience does include people who are academics, it also includes people who are in and out of academia, e.g. myself, because I'm someone who attended academia. I have my master's degree, and I have my PhD, which I wrote independently outside of academia while using academic arguments combined with non-academic arguments. So yeah, that's just another thing that Solomon is wrong about that I didn't have time to include in the essay itself. But in the future, if Solomon responds to me and says something especially stupid, I can respond to him and be like, hey, you're stupid, and here's why I think you're stupid in an essay. It's not really a debate, because a debate is where two people sit in front of each other and they're like debating, vocally back and forth. And while academics technically debate each other with essays, it's a completely different format of argument. Like, you can take your time, you can provide sources, and you can do all of these things that are impossible to do in a conversational debate bro setting. So that's something I want to bring to YouTube. And I don't want to just respond to people I disagree with, like Solomon Nelson, but I also want to respond to people that I agree with, or things that I agree with, if not individual arguments or thinkers. So that's something that I plan to do in the future. I don't know what I'm going to do next. I do have a couple of things that I plan on watching. So, for instance, I have a video, here's why Elon Musk's Mars fantasy is BS. And that concerns topics that I've researched before, that I've studied before academically, and that I've consumed non-academically. So I think that'll be a really fun one to respond to. But here's the thing. Sometimes if I watch videos, I don't necessarily feel compelled to write an essay. In order for me to do that with a YouTube video, it would have to be someone who pisses me off, re. Solomon Nelson, or it would have to be about something that I haven't written extensively about before. And for instance, this essay is something that I hadn't really written about before extensively. I hadn't written about doctors being cops that deny people health care in a cop-like way. So in a sense, again, I wasn't kidding when I thanked Solomon Nelson for doing his response, because it led to me being like, oh, hey, well, first of all, Solomon's completely wrong about fascism, but also he's giving me something to talk about through this essay as killing two birds with one stone, responding to him, but also extending my body of work to include writing about white moderate doctors functioning as cops. So yeah, there's that. That is essentially the future of my work and what I'll primarily be doing. One of these days I'll write that book about mushroom men, but one of these days. But yeah, if you like this essay, feel free to leave a comment. That includes Solomon Nelson. I can't say I'm looking forward to his response, but I am curious as to what he'll have to say. I have responded to quite a few things that he said directly, but I've also included some food for thought, because I'm trying to educate him as well as his audience, as well as my audience, just people more broadly. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to comments from other people too. Don't be shy, like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. And until next time, stay safe out there.